Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Becky Schilling. It's great to have you with us for today's eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of media, ad tech, and MarTech. Today, we're talking about customer data platform tactics, including team building, implementation, initial use cases, and ongoing expansion. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Rajiv Chhatwal, Senior Manager with Capgemini.
Thank you, Becky. Good to be here.
And Steve Zisk, Product Marketing Principal with Redpoint Global.
Thank you, Becky. Looking forward to the discussion.
Before we get into it, to our audience, let's keep it conversational today. Just use the chat window on the right at any time to submit questions, and I will do my best to get to as many as we can, so keep them coming. We have a great conversation planned for today. Steve, over to you.
Thank you so much, Becky. We're going to be talking about customer data platforms in the context of how to select, implement, and expand them. And in that context, I look at customer data platforms as a journey, not as a destination. And the reason for that is that we as marketers are in a very dynamic marketing environment with MarTech changes all over the place, changes in customer expectations and preferences, new social platforms, new different kinds of technical initiatives that all drive change in our marketing world. And in order to meet that kind of change, we need platforms that can help us understand the customers better, improve ROI, improve our own marketing journeys and experiences. And a customer data platform acts as a central hub for our customer data. We're going to talk about that platform in 4 different stages. The first of those is decision making. Let's get right to it. I'll talk a little bit about how best practices operate in each of these stages, and then I'll bring Rajiv into the conversation in order to talk about some practical use cases and stories from customer implementations. So in decision making, the core of what we're doing in choosing a customer data platform is meeting those customer outcomes that we think will best serve our needs as marketers, our organization's needs, and our customer needs. And that means that we want to start with aligning goals, with understanding how the team is going to be operating, how the technology that we're implementing is going to fit with our existing and future stack, and what the technology capabilities are. In that context, all of these elements need to be fit to the outcomes that we're looking for. In other words, we're going to be matching capabilities, goals, and teams to the understanding those outcomes. The final point I would make here is that this gives us our first chance to start preparing for what CDP success looks like. And that means, as a best practice, we're going to start inventorying what kinds of data that we need to have and prioritizing its use, tying that data into the use cases that we care about. And of course, because this is customer data, recognizing that we need to be thinking about governance, not necessarily IT governance, but governance in the sense of what are we allowed to do with this data? What do our customers expect us to do? How are regulators going to be working with us? So in the context of all of those goals and that data and the alignment and governance, Rajiv, can you talk to us for a minute about how this plays out in your experience in selecting a CDP platform?
Thank you, Steve. Yes. I'll just focus in on your first point, which was about goal alignment. And what typically happens is that there are really 2 main groups there, right? One is the technical assessment piece. This is really where I call like sort of the IT organization or the teams that make that piece. The other one is the business alignment. This is the marketing side, the CMO's office, and content creation, all those kind of people. And I won't go into each one of these blocks, but you can see that even though when you're running an assessment, that you think about foundational use cases, how the future scaling is going to work in light of like you said, upcoming technologies, integration with use cases, and so on, and what the KPIs are. instead of going and talking to them separately, I like to look at it as an integrated view. So if you go to the next slide, what we like to do is, on one side, if you look at it, just the same triangle, but now integrated, where the business assessment is one leg of the triangle, the technical assessment is the other, and they both stand on these two very strong, what I call pillars of CDP strategy, which is customer experience and then data. So these are the two main pillars that we build these assessments on. And of course, you can see at the apex, it's all business focused, because ultimately the objective is to make sure you are in regulatory compliance and the privacy constraints that are now coming up in the market. How do you build customer acquisition and retention? How do you build proper personalization for higher brand loyalty? So once we have presented this integrated view, we will then sit down with these different teams and put together an assessment, and literally we'll come up with either a CDP based on those needs, or maybe a composable sort of strategy where there are a couple of different elements that go on to make it. But the focus is to build an integrated, aligned goal view for the organization.
That's great information, and that sort of leads us right into the next stage, where we're talking about implementation. And this really represents our first opportunity to build support and to gather information from across the teams and across the rest of the organization based on those objectives. You had 5 nice objectives up at the top in terms of the kinds of business outcomes that somebody might want. And those objectives get translated during the implementation into a set of capabilities across teams and process and the technology itself. So in that context, the practices that I want to focus on are in the 4 areas that we see on the slide here. For the teams may be centralized teams or maybe channel-driven teams. Defining all of the communications requirements and the use cases that we're going to do as part of the initial work in the CDP is the number one thing that we need to do as part of the early implementation. That will be used to guide everything else that happens during the implementation. Along with that, setting out a training and education plan becomes really important, and recognizing that in order to have real CDP success, it's not just the initial marketing teams and the initial sets of users who have to understand what's going on. It's the entire organization. And then finally, of course, putting some measurements into place. What are we going to measure as KPIs? What are we going to measure as customer outcomes? How are we going to look at the differences between the current state and the new state, that the to-be state, if you will, with the CDP, so that we can understand what kinds of returns we're going to have? That then drills down into the 3 other areas that I talk about here. Data requirements, of course, the use cases that we defined early on and the outcomes that we defined during the selection stage become the fodder for how do I understand the data that I need to bring in and make sure that I'm connecting it? How do I treat it consistently? How do I make sure that the quality is up to snuff for the kinds of uses that I'm going to be implementing? And then how does that translate into the CX strategy that you talked about a minute ago, Rajiv? Personalization, similar kind of story. We have to decide how much personalization is enough. Where do we get a balance between being too creepy and following somebody around at the very, very detailed level versus making sure that we show them that we understand them? How do we get the customers to buy into the strategy that we're doing and recognize that there's a value exchange going on? In other words, share my data in exchange for a better experience, in the context of privacy and compliance, you, the marketer, will be a good steward of my data, and you will follow my requirements in terms of what you share and how that's going to change my experience. And then, of course, as we're completing implementation, we need to be starting to plan ahead. What is rollout going to look like? Who are the first users going to be? How are we going to do measurements and experiences and experiments? And how are we going to gain momentum? So I'd love to hear from you, Rajiv, a little bit about how that implementation operates in some real world situations where you've done CDPs.
Yeah, I actually, I'm very fortunate. We're working with a very nice client in perspective of how we, as an implementation team and as a client team, collaborate. And here's a good example to build on what you just talked about, Steve. That what is the current state and what is the ultimate vision? So this example here. This is a very a brand which is a very reputable, very high-end brand, and their vision was to be a leading brand in hospitality and ultimate guest experience. And so we translate that into what I call pillars of ambition, and in here there were four ambitions: guest experience, brand excellence, insights, and operational efficiencies. If you see sort of the first two, the ones on the top are really about the brand and the marketing side. The other two are very, marketing impactful, but really IT sort of driven. So here we go again in collaboration of the teams working together. And then without going into all the details, you can see here what are the barriers we are going to have to overcome to translate this objectives into the vision of the client. So in many of these implementations, if we have a very sort of a clear way to be able to articulate the vision, understand the pillars of the ambition, and then further drill down into just maybe 3 or 4 key areas, it's easy to understand what are the barriers. And that translate further down into sort of better use cases, better implementation strategy, and that's kind of what we did here. So everything that you mentioned about the success in terms of understanding hurdles, understanding teams, all that applies right here. So very good information about how to achieve success in CDP implementations.
That's great, and I imagine that articulating that vision actually may start during the selection process, because the vision is also going to drive some of the use cases, and of course that vision is likely to carry over along with a really clear focus on objectives and on the need to overcome some of those barriers as we transition from the implementation to the production readiness and the actual MVP, if you will, the minimum viable product and the minimum viable process that's required to support the kinds of use cases that we're doing in the CDP. So in the context of that transition, the big question is always going to be, are we there yet? Since the CDP is a journey and not a final destination, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're trying to produce an agile process and make sure that in that arena, we are defining what an MVP looks like, what are the use cases that are specifically going to demonstrate value, how do we make sure that the data itself is ready for prime time? Do my teams understand how to use the data and what they're going to be doing in order to progress along through the different kinds of use cases? And then internally, I will have set up some of those KPIs, and I now have to make sure that I've picked the right metrics that allow me to measure those KPIs. Those metrics, obviously, there are going to be some internal but important business metrics like total cost of ownership on the cost side, or return on investment in terms of the product or services that I may need to sell. But those those KPIs also need to include customer KPIs, particularly around things like customer satisfaction, if you're trying to measure that, and attribution to tie the customer outcomes that you're getting back to the changes that you've made. The other point that I would make in thinking about measuring success is that if we're going to be agile in our approach to the CDP and the underlying technology, we also want to be agile in our approach to the marketing itself. So one of the values that a CDP can give you is the ability to do a lot of different things much more quickly and easily, and to measure a lot of different things much more quickly and easily than we might have in the past. And that gives us the opportunity to do experiments, whether those are classical A/B tests or other kinds of experiments, and to measure the success or failure of those experiments very, very quickly. And we shouldn't be scared as marketers of having failures. And I don't necessarily mean failures like, oh my God, I've made things worse, but failures like, I'm looking for this kind of an improvement, and maybe I only got this much improvement, or improvement in these particular areas and not in these other areas. So we shouldn't be shy about looking at what we're doing and seeing what's working and what's not working. And in that context, we're also going to be trying to operationalize the changes that we've made, both in terms of the data that we're handling and the process that we're looking at. And ideally, you want to have your tooling, the CDP capabilities that we talked about earlier, support that operationalization through things like data observability, where we are looking at all the data that's coming into the system as well as the data that's going out of the system from the point of view of, is it meeting our quality metrics? Is it moving along fast enough? Is it a good representation of the accuracy and completeness that we need for the customer experiences that we're looking at? And driving that process are things like making sure that we continue the training that we're doing and the guidance that we're giving, both within our marketing teams and within some of the operational areas where, presumably, since we're now at or approaching first light, we've started to promote some of the ideas of CDP success into other parts of the organization, and using that visibility, the guidance that we're giving, the training and the promotion to surface potential other needs. We're on a journey. We're reaching MVP. There are going to be other use cases that we may have put off. There are going to be other use cases that our own internal teams are thinking about or discovering. And there are going to be other use cases that may be coming up from other teams within the organization. So in that context, measuring and monitoring all of the data flowing through the system is important, and returns from those touch points is also important. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Rajiv, a little bit on how that might translate into what people might be learning from the initial CDP implementation.
Yeah, no, thank you. Before I touch on that, just you remember what we've talked about. The vision has brought all the groups together. The pillars of ambition are now defining the strategy. That helps us define the areas that are going to be impacted. Now we need to actually understand, how do you measure the impact? So before even we begin, and sometimes it is hard, because if you see some of these metrics that you see on the screen right now, some of them are harder ones than others, but typically in this most recent implementation, I sort of created these 4 sort of groups of measurements, and the transformation and agility was driving how well the IT organization was going to use its existing landscape, as well as how the marketing teams were going to use that landscape and smoothen out their particular marketing impact, all the way from unified identity to activation. Revenue growth was a very, very important factor, because it was driven by how effective is our segmentation, how effectively we reach the guests or our customers, and furthermore, what is the brand impact, brand loyalty, which then leads obviously into people returning back to the brand. Cost savings across both organizations, whether it's IT or business, and then personalized experience is really where what I call the real attachment to the brand begins. So we created a bunch of metrics, and this was a collective effort in talking with the client. And then I chose like one from each category, which I felt like I could measure when we went into an MVP. And so, data integration management was a key one for us. I chose that one. The revenue growth, we wanted to look at how well segments and audiences could be created if the unified identity worked well. Cost saving was, of course, landscape integration and lesser number of clicks to do the same type of work, because now systems are much more integrated and flow. And personalized experiences about attachment in terms of how a customer looks at your brand. Once we had that in place, Steve, if you go to the next slide, this is like the brass tacks now. Now I'm hands-on, right? It's a very simple flow. I think most of you've seen it. Sources are on one side. They're all getting integrated. This, in fact, is actually the flow from a Redpoint implementation, which you and I worked on together. And the sources are, go through this process where there is, intake, harmonization, hygiene, transformation. And then we come to the main portion, which is matching. Matching is what is going to result in identity resolution. And this is all first-party data in our first MVP. So we were very good about understanding how, we could then use that in creating a golden record. But more importantly, we could then measure, because now the identities have come together, we can see how a customer is touching different facets of that brand in that journey. And we could get their value to us. So once this was established, we actually ran the MVP, I think 3-4 months effort of each process. There were, about 7 sources. And we then did this. This is a very involved process where you run it through each step. You then go back to the business. Business looks at it. We do a few fine tunes because there are different parameters here of how you match things and so on and so forth. Until the business feels, yes, we are doing this correctly, and this will allow them to measure the value of their customer as well as create what I call really effective, reachable audiences. And that's how like an MVP succeeds. But tough work. But thanks to your platform, this piece we really did a great job. So,
thank you so much, Rajiv. This is great information. I would point out that we've sort of gone deep into the weeds here in the context of identity resolution. We could go equally deep around scalability, around for many, but not all customers, things like latency and real time that are consequences of scalability. But I do want to make sure that we tie this back to what's going to happen next in the CDP arena, which is around how do we define continuing success? What does process improvement look like? What are our teams going to be doing for their next trick, if you will? And there's a whole bunch of different best practices here. Once you've got those initial successes, you want to be able to consolidate the success and define exactly what you're going to be doing for measuring the outcomes in later areas, communicating the challenges that you've had and how you overcame them, avoiding disillusionment. It's very, very, a CDP can be a shiny object, if you will. Everybody's looking to a CDP to solve particular problems that they may have. And if the initial MVP doesn't immediately sort of provide results for every team that was thinking, oh, a CDP is going to solve my problem, they might become disillusioned, making sure that they're on board with how are we going to handle your process problems, how are we going to handle your UX, how are we going to improve your customer interactions, becomes a part of what we need to do to continue to grow and promote the CDP. The other thing that we're going to be likely doing at this stage is to recognize that the CDP, per the slide that you just showed us, is now giving us golden records, much better identity resolution, much more sort of consistent information, and the ability to build out beyond those 7 sources to many other additional sources as we go. And that represents a broadening of the horizons beyond just the marketing value of the CDP into other areas. So, could that hotel chain start using the CDP at the front desk to greet high-value customers in a way that improves that customer's sense of personalization? Could a retailer use a CDP at a returns desk to understand better what the different processes and customer requirements are for handling a return in a way that makes the customer a happy customer and a customer who can look at the next things? Could a bank use it in a bank branch to come up with the best possible personalized offer for the customer who's standing in front of a bank officer, not just back in the marketing area on the website? So needs beyond marketing become very, very important for a CDP. I don't know if you have any particular comments that you'd like to make on this, Rajiv, but there certainly is room for a lot of thinking about this in terms of where we're going with it.
No, I actually want to just build on what you talked about, how to scale. But before one does that, I think it's important that we sit and look at lessons learned from an MVP. What you see is just some categories of lessons learned, and these really impacted our scalability because we understood issues if they were with data quality. We looked at doing both positive negative testing. Data modeling was extremely important to us because how data would scale versus being in a dev environment. Match requirements, like I talked to you about earlier. What's the strategy of how do you bring customers together, households together, build identity graphs, and then lastly, how does this integrate in an overall landscape? And so once you have that sort of core learning so that you can adjust your next move, you do one more thing, which is, try and bring in some of the best practices. So just high level view of, what we look at from best practices, what's the data quality? How do you perfect data when you're actually moving? Because the quality of match, whether it's fuzzy, probabilistic, or deterministic, really drives several things down the road, right? It impacts how you set up your audiences, how you actually are able to calculate value, and so those kind of things. The contextual awareness, of course, is understanding across devices or behaviorally, or if a certain offer is being done in a certain context, how do you really do that? So those were sort of the big things that we did, and then we scaled the implementation further, and then took it to the next step, to like what you say, scale it up, see if you're meeting the right outcomes, and that's what we did.
That's a great story and sort of fits very, very well with what we were talking about with the agility of building out a CDP. We've gone full circle and come back to making sure that we get the right outcome as we go, and continue to focus on all of the details and best practices that we did, like Center of Excellence that we got a chance to mention. I do want to take one small sidetrack into taking a look at the Redpoint CDP capabilities in the context of how do we use technology itself to fulfill some of those points that you brought up, the objectives around retention, compliance, acquisition, and so on. We should recognize that the platform itself has specific details and features that are designed to help us along each element of that journey from ingested data to golden record. And each of those is providing us with some intelligence and the ability to drive information out to the teams and improve the automation and the process overall. So the goal of having underlying technology like this for the kinds of projects that you've been talking about, Rajiv, is to make sure that there's a really good match between the process and best practices that we've been talking about from the team's point of view and the technology that we're using in order to deliver that outcome. So I'd love to then go from here and take some questions. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions that have come in over the half hour that we've been talking. So I'd like to turn it back over to Becky to take us out with a bunch of user questions.
Great. Thank you for sharing your stories about embarking on your CDP journey, from setting your goals, getting to first light, and then expanding your horizons. Steve and Rajiv, thank you so much for sharing those insights. We've got a few questions, so let's get straight into it. Our first one, how does the idea of best practices change when building a CDP as a composable CDP or cloud-based CDP?
That's a great question. Rajiv mentioned composability a little bit earlier. I'm gonna take it in a slightly different direction and talk about a couple of different things here. The first thing to understand is that CDPs are really designed overall as part of essentially a modular or composable architecture. And the distinction that I make here is that in a composable architecture, all of the different components within the composable architecture should be executing unitary business functions and should be talking to each other through pre-designed APIs. The goal of all of that is to make it fast, easy, and agile to make changes, to select the best pieces for the process, and so on. The more recent, over the past 6 months to a year, discussions around so-called composable CDPs have really been talking about a slightly different area, which is the idea of operating a set of composable software on top of a cloud database or a cloud data store, if you will. Again, in this area, this is something that Redpoint has been doing for 10 years and more, is operating on top of the existing databases that our customers have and providing the ability to federate information across the database and across the operational stores that Redpoint has, things like offers and offer history and campaigns and channels and all the details that a CDP itself needs to keep track of in order to do its work. Rajiv, would you like to add something to that?
Just a couple of quick comments, right? I mean, Steve, if you look at identity and insight and activation or orchestration, right? Just those three individual modules, like you talked about, they're all composable with and interacting with each other. Depends upon, again, customer emphasis, customer use cases. That's one big piece of composability. The other one is, how do you want to use it? Is it cloud or is it on-prem, or how it's interacting? And the third one, which I talk about, is its integration with existing MarTech, AdTech landscapes. And if you have it's very rare to have a very clean approach because, we've all been using these different pieces for so long. So that's where that concept comes in. And I think it's so driven by the next level of optimization, existing landscapes, the focus of the customer. So that's what I would say, Becky, about that. But it's not uncommon at all for people to look at these as pieces that fit into each other or work with each other.
Great. tackling off of something that Steve mentioned in his presentation, how do we collect use cases from departments that are outside of marketing who may not be engaged in the CDP selection process?
Yeah, I'll start that off, Steve. Whenever we think about CDP, our first instinct is always to talk about identity resolution and profile unification. And we start that discussion. It goes further into how is the data sources being coming in? What's the landscape of the current architecture? When you go to the other side, marketing is constantly talking about journeys, orchestration, ROI, activation, omni-channel. How do we connect to that? So the way I've sort of approached it is go back to my initial triangle, and I say, what's your data strategy? What's your customer experience strategy? And then see where the overlap is and build those foundational use cases that impact or enable both groups. And that's how you would go outside just marketing to actually talk to IT and say, what pieces are you supporting to marketing that actually enable the marketing objective? Because that's really what we're trying to do. Over 60-70% of surveys will lean towards personalization, customer journey, better audience as the ultimate objective of CDPs. They just feel identity resolution is just going to come along for the ride, but it's a very hard thing to do, as we all know. So, Steve.
The only thing that I would add to that, Rajiv, is that if you've done a good job during the implementation process of socializing what you're doing with the CDP, defining the measures, demonstrating success, and so on, then you will have the visibility that's required both within IT and within some of the other operational departments to actually start surfacing some of those use cases. And there's a lot of different use cases throughout both the operational areas, analytics, data science, customer service and support, customer success, a lot of different places that you can go and talk to. So identifying the different teams and groups within the organization that might benefit from a CDP is a good start for that as well.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it's going to be one of the hot topics of the day, generative AI. How can generative AI be applied to the CDP world that you have shown us today? And what are some of the main Gen AI use cases for CDPs?
I'll tackle that first, if I may. That the generative AI is the 2023s and late 2022s shiny new object. Everybody's been talking about it a lot. There are some interesting things that people think about when they're thinking about it more broadly for their general jobs. But what I'd like to do is to take it out from this sort of abstract, cool, is it going to replace me? Is it going to help me arena, and bring it down to very concrete, practical levels. We laid out some steps earlier, both steps in terms of the process of building and deploying a CDP, and the steps within the CDP that are getting used in order to gain returns. For each of those steps, there's a set of very specific things that you can do with generative AI to help those steps. So for instance, data ingestion, be able to show something like ChatGPT, here's the data that I have that's coming in. Can you analyze some patterns for me? Or using, for instance, if you're using a BI tool to analyze some data, being able to use something like Microsoft Copilot to say, what do you see in this data? What's working well? Where are the places within the data that are not giving me the information that I expected out of it, and be able to ask questions like those. Once you get into, and same thing is true, by the way, for data quality and for identity resolution. Those are sort of internally facing pieces of the process where what I'm trying to do is create that golden record that we talked about, and use generative AI to help me, or other means, standard machine learning and neural networks and so on, to help me produce a better golden record. Once I start actually using that golden record to drive results on the output, there's a whole bunch of other kinds of Gen AI use cases. Things like ChatGPT, can you help me to see what the natural segments are within this set of golden records? Or ChatGPT, can you help me to figure out how I should be approaching customers? Here's an email. Can you give me 5 potential subject lines for this email, and then I can use my CDP to do experiments across those and figure out which of those subject lines is the most valid. The only caution I would give you, and it's a huge caution, is that in general, ChatGPT and all of the generative AI frameworks charge you based on the number of tokens that you're feeding to them. So it may not be an area where you want to feed your entire spectrum of customer data into them. That's millions or billions of individual tokens that you're trying to feed into ChatGPT. It's going to be expensive and the performance is not going to be very good. You're going to want to be feeding aggregated data, personas, composite and compiled information into ChatGPT, or smaller doses of data. I've got these high-value customers. What can I learn about these high-value customers through the use of AI and ML? Anything you'd like to add to that, Rajiv?
I know we're short of time. I'll just add 1 or 2. I work a lot with hospitality and life sciences clients. Very important element of Gen AI is trust. And so when you trust something to interact with your customer, you really need to make sure that it doesn't impact any negativity in your brand relationship. Simple examples, I'll give you 1 or 2 that I'm trying to put a little workshop together for a few of our hospitality clients is, the ability to do creative and dynamic offers, right? Because Gen AI is very good at creating dynamic content of things that are on the property or around the property, or interests that you have. So that's a very good use case. The fact that you can do natural language processing, it can understand languages, it can respond, those type of things. Learning pieces of your past behavior and doing some sort of prediction, which is not sent directly, but allows like a customer service person or a concierge person to learn more about saying this could be a really good option. Those are kind of the things that I feel are early success stories of this emerging technology. But as that trust builds, as we get better, you will see more of it in some of these industries.
Great. Steve, Rajiv, thank you again for this great content and answering all the questions from our audience. We really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you about eMarketer's upcoming events. Join us tomorrow, Friday, November 3rd, for Attention, our half-day live virtual summit focused on trends and predictions for 2024. Registration is open on our events page. And while you're on that events page, you can also register for upcoming live analyst and Tech Talk webinars. Finally, keep an eye on your email for the link to today's recording. Thank you again for your time, and thanks again to Rajiv, Steve, the team at Redpoint Global, and our Studio II crew, our production team behind the scenes, for making this webinar possible. We'll see you all on the next Tech Talk.